Conversations with Bourdieu, the Johannesburg Moment. The book is co-authored by Professor Michael Bromoy, the Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Berkeley.
At the end, quite rightly noting the brilliance of Parliament's point, which is to talk about the crisis which exists. It's in moments of crisis when we move beyond simply talking about symbolic violence towards talking about physical violence. Now, these moments of crisis, I would suggest, are related to the economic crisis within capitalism. The kind of thing which we've seen on an ongoing basis in South Africa over many years, but which we're now seeing much more clearly today, particularly in the European case, Spain, unemployment levels above 20%. And it's precisely this crisis in Europe that I would like to suggest gives this book a resonance to a much wider audience around the world. And it's for that reason that I would like to see this book published more widely and read more widely. But to piece that argument together, we need to go beyond seeing this as a discussion of theories about superstructure, which is the way in which you present it might be in a very interesting and very valuable way. I think it's important that we have theories of superstructure and debate the question of superstructure. But for Bourdieu, superstructure was rooted in material relations, just as it has been for Michael, and just I think as it has been for Karl. But sometimes these things get missed. You know, when we're critiquing a book, we argue along the same terms as the person who's written that book. But we need to go back and make sure that those biases which creep into the way in which we understand these things are not biases which then affect the general overview, our general theory of what's happening. So that's my suggestion. But let me end by quoting once more. This is just from Bourdieu's little book, Acts of Resistance, but I think it's appropriate. He concludes, I will say that one of the problems is to be reflexive. A grand word, he says, but it is not used gratuitously. Our objective is not only to invent responses, but to invent a way of inventing responses, to invent a new form of organisation of the work of contestation, and of organisation of contestation, of the task of activism. Bourdieu here is not against invention of responses, but he wants to go beyond that. And so I would suggest to everybody here that the way in which we should respond now is to invent a response to tomorrow's general strike by supporting and participating in that strike, and the next day to read this wonderful book and to see it as a way of inventing new ways of responding.
Never disappointed, always is a struggle issue in any event. So most people in this room will join the march tomorrow, the 7th of March. Then you don't speak much time.
I unfortunately wasn't here in 2010 when Michael and Karl conceived this book. I first came across the contents of this book on Michael's website. I'm not exactly sure when you posted the original versions of these lectures, these talks. It must have been around 2010. And I quite fortuitously found Michael's lectures about the conversations between a series of other theorists and Bourdieu on his website. And I read them avidly. Whilst I was reading them, one thing struck me about the way in which South African scholars in South Africa, how we practice our debate. It struck me that it's very rare for us to have conversations of the kind that Michael set up there. So we often ignore each other's words. And when we do cite each other, we often just cite each other as sources of quotes, perhaps as sources of facts. We very rarely, I think, actually take each other's ideas really seriously and engage with what other people have written and acknowledge them and credit them at the level of ideas. I think this is one of the pathologies of South African intellectual debate. Michael shows us in this book that Bourdieu was a bit like us. Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is Bourdieu was probably a bit of a prick, right? Put it really bluntly, right? He wrote an enormous amount. So what's very clear is that he didn't bother to read other scholars who were really writing about the same things as himself. And when he read them belatedly, he was dismissive of them. And Michael shows this in all of the conversations that he sets out. So there's a conversation, Michael sets up a conversation with Marx and Bourdieu, conversation between Antonio Gramsci and Bourdieu, which in some ways is the most revealing because Bourdieu later in his life said, oh, I finally got around to reading Gramsci. And he basically says what I've already said. And then Michael's version will be more nuanced than mine. And then Michael sets up a conversation between, I'll get the order wrong, but between Fanon and Bourdieu, between Paulo Freire and Bourdieu, between Simone de Beauvoir and Bourdieu, which is like a particularly powerful chapter, where Bourdieu's book really on gender, Michael shows a lot of it really is anticipated by Simone de Beauvoir. And living in Paris, there's actually no excuse for Bourdieu not to have actually been more cognizant of what Simone de Beauvoir did. And then there's a final chapter is a debate with Mr. C. Wright Mills, who's a rather anonymous cast in this character in the cast, but brings out some other aspects of Bourdieu. So Bourdieu wasn't a conversationalist himself. He didn't actually engage with conversations. But Michael drags him out of his Parisian refuge and forces him, rather unhappily, to engage in these conversations with a series of theorists. And it's really interesting. It certainly changed the way I view Bourdieu. And it made me much more critical of Bourdieu, to put it mildly. And it also reminded me of really the importance of conversation. And what I really like about this book is I think it's one of the things I like about this book is it's an appeal to say, let's have more conversations. Let's take ideas seriously. So Michael forces Bourdieu into these conversations. Then Carl comes in with a commentary at the end of his chapter, forcing a conversation between Bourdieu and whoever the influencer is, Fanon, Simone de Beauvoir, Marx, and the South African text. Right? And this is really rich because I think Carl forces an issue onto the agenda, which is a real challenge to Bourdieusian scholars, which is, Bourdieu is held out to be a theorist of order. He's a theorist in the way in which the social order is reproduced over time. And so he's often seen as a theorist, quite a conservative theorist in many ways, and Peter picks up on some of that. But what happens when we try and think through a society which is very disorderly in a Bourdieusian frame? Can we use Bourdieu? Can we set up a conversation where we're not so much engaging with him directly, but using him and indirectly challenging him by applying him, by taking his theories, by trampling his theories into a very different context? Of course, when 2010 Carl was writing this, he was also immersed, I think I'm saying this, in his study of xenophobic attacks in 2009, previous year. And that certainly comes through the book, and I think some of the most provocative bits of Carl's writings are where Carl is really trying to think through some aspects of the xenophobic attacks in the light of Bourdieu. This is, I think, a rich conversation, and it's limited. It's limited. This is Carl's probably written 50 pages, but I see it as an invitation to continue this debate. Now, unlike Michael, I'm not convinced that we should throw Bourdieu away quite as quickly as Michael's accounts would have us. I mean, in research that I do in my students in Cape Town, I'm struck by the way in which many sort of Bourdieusian ideas, I think, have real relevance to study